All right, so exam season is coming up, and I know a lot of you are probably feeling the pressure, especially when it comes to that media industries and audiences course. It can be a tough one.
Yeah, it's a lot to take in, but don't worry, we're here to help you navigate the key concepts and ace that exam.
Exactly. We've got your Grade Guru course summaries right here, and we're going to break it all down for you chapter by chapter in a way that's actually, understandable and maybe even a little bit fun.
We're going to highlight those essential takeaways, offer some study tips along the way, and try to bring this stuff to life with some real-world examples.
Think of this as your ultimate study guide. Okay, ready to dive in?
Absolutely.
Great. Let's start with chapter 1, Media and the Social World. Now, this might seem obvious, but it's worth asking. Why is studying media even important?
Well, think about it. Media is everywhere these days. It's on our phones, it's on our TVs, it's on our computers. It's practically unavoidable.
It's true. I mean, most of us spend hours every day consuming media in one form or another.
Exactly. And that's precisely why it's so important to understand how it works, how it shapes our perceptions, our values, even our behaviors.
So it's not just about passively consuming, it's about actively understanding how media influences our world.
Absolutely. And this chapter really drives that point home. It even mentions the Arab Spring as a powerful example of media's impact.
Ah, the Arab Spring, those uprisings in the early 2010s. How does that connect to media?
Well, social media wasn't just a way for people to connect with friends back then. It became a tool for organizing protests, spreading information, challenging those authoritarian regimes.
Wow, so media actually helped to fuel a social and political movement.
Exactly. It shows how powerful a force it can be.
Okay, so we've got media shaping societies, but this chapter also talks about how it shapes individuals through socialization.
Right. We all learn those norms and values of our culture through different experiences like family, school, even just observing those around us, for
Yeah,
sure.
that makes sense.
Well, media has become a major player in that socialization process.
So it's not just our parents telling us how to behave anymore. It's also the movies we watch, the music we listen to, those influencers we follow online.
Precisely. And one of the key theories that helps explain this is social learning theory.
Social learning theory. Tell me more about that.
It basically suggests that we learn by observing and imitating others. And that applies big time to the media we consume. Like if we see unrealistic beauty standards in magazines or on social media, it can influence our own body image and self-esteem.
That makes sense. We're constantly bombarded with images and messages that tell us how we should look, how we should act, what we should buy.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to be critical consumers of media and to recognize those underlying messages that might be influencing us.
Got it. Okay, so be prepared to explain social learning theory on the exam and be ready to give some specific examples of how it plays out in the real world.
Absolutely. Now, moving on to how media shapes social relationships. This chapter talks about how it's not just about information, it's about connection. Shared media experiences, they give us those common threads that connect us to others.
So like how everyone's talking about the latest hit show or that viral video, it gives us something to bond over.
Precisely. It gives us those shared experiences that bring us together, even if just for a moment.
Okay, but it's not just about those casual connections, right? The summary also highlights how media can bridge that gap between individuals and institutions.
Right. Think about something like political campaigns, for example. Media provides that crucial link between those candidates and voters, shaping public perception and influencing those election outcomes.
So media plays a role in the political process, shaping how we view those candidates and issues.
Absolutely. It's not just entertainment, it's shaping the political landscape.
Okay, so far we've got socialization, relationships, and political influence. Media is a busy bee. Now what about this whole structure versus agency thing? I always struggle with that concept.
It can be a tricky one, but it's a key concept in media studies. Think of structure as those systems, those rules, those norms that shape and constrain media production.
Okay, so it's like the framework or the set of guidelines that everyone in the media industry has to operate within.
Exactly. But within those constraints, individuals still have agency, which means they have the ability to make choices and exert their own influence on the process.
Okay, so think of a journalist who has strong opinions, but still has to operate within the ethical guidelines and editorial standards of their news organization. That's structure versus agency in action.
Precisely. That tension between the individual's creative freedom and those larger systemic forces is a constant theme in media studies.
It's like trying to find that sweet spot between following the rules and expressing your own voice.
You got it.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, last but not least in this chapter is the historical development of media. I always get bogged down in all those dates and names.
I know what you mean. But don't worry too much about memorizing every single detail. The key here is to understand the big picture.
Okay, so what should we focus on?
Focus on those major shifts in media technology and how they impacted how media is produced and consumed. For instance, the printing press. It was a total game changer.
The printing press. Yeah, that was a pretty big deal, right?
Huge. Before that, information was largely controlled by those elite few who could read and write. The printing press made it possible to mass-produce books and newspapers, making knowledge accessible to a wider population.
So it was a catalyst for the spread of literacy and the democratization of knowledge.
Exactly. It fueled the Renaissance, sparked those religious revolutions, and paved the way for mass communication as we know it.
Wow, it's amazing to think about how one invention could have such a profound impact on history.
Okay, so printing press, check. What else should we have on our historical timeline?
Well, sound recording and film were pretty massive innovations, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. They revolutionized storytelling and entertainment.
Right. Suddenly, music wasn't just a live experience, it could be recorded and shared.
And movies brought those stories to life in a whole new way. And then came radio and television, bringing news and entertainment into people's homes.
Radio created that shared national experience, while TV added visuals to the mix, transforming how we consume everything, from news to sitcoms.
And of course, now we're in the digital age, with the internet and mobile tech constantly pushing those boundaries.
It's hard to keep up with all the changes. But I guess that's why understanding those historical shifts is so important. It helps us make sense of the media world we live in today.
Precisely.
Okay, that wraps up Chapter 1. How are we feeling about this one?
I think we've got a good foundation. Now let's dive into Chapter 2, the evolution of media technology. This chapter takes a closer look at those technological milestones we just discussed.
All right, hit us with those game changers. Let's start with the printing press again. I know we already touched on it, but it's worth emphasizing just how revolutionary it was.
It really was. It's hard to imagine a world where information was primarily controlled by the elite.
Right. Access to knowledge was limited to a select few.
And then comes this invention that enables mass production of books and newspapers, and suddenly information is spreading like wildfire.
It's amazing how one invention can have such a ripple effect throughout history.
It is.
Okay, so printing press, check. What's next on our technological timeline?
Sound, recording, and film. Huge for storytelling and entertainment.
I can't imagine a world without recorded music or movies.
Right. But think about it. We haven't just seen the initial invention. The way we consume sound and film has continued to evolve dramatically. Look at the music industry.
Oh, yeah, good point. We went from those big vinyl records to cassettes, then to CDs, then digital downloads, and now streaming is king.
Exactly. It's a constant evolution.
And each new format comes with its own set of economic and social implications.
Right. It reminds us that technology doesn't just change how we do things, it also influences the culture and the economics of an entire industry.
So true. Okay, how about radio and television? How did they shake things up?
Radio was the first broadcast medium that could reach mass audiences without any physical distribution. Imagine that. Suddenly you could hear news and entertainment from around the world.
And then TV added visuals to the mix, bringing those moving images and sound right into people's living rooms.
It totally transformed how we consumed news and entertainment.
It's incredible how quickly these technologies changed our world. And then, of course, the internet and mobile technology came along, and, well, everything changed again.
The internet, initially developed for military communication, has become this vast network of information and communication that connects the world.
And mobile tech put that power in our pockets, making media accessible anytime, anywhere.
It's hard to imagine life without these devices now. They've become extensions of ourselves. But while we're talking about how technology shapes our world, let's touch on a couple of key theories. Have you heard of technological determinism?
I think so, but refresh my memory.
It basically argues that technology is the driving force behind social change. It determines how society evolves.
So, like, the invention of the printing press led to widespread literacy.
Exactly. Or the internet connected the world and flattened those hierarchies. But like any theory, it has its limitations. Because ultimately, people choose how they use technology.
Right, it's not like technology has a mind of its own and dictates how we live our lives. Isn't that where social constructionism comes in?
Yes. Social constructionism emphasizes that human agency and social forces play a role in shaping how technology is developed and used.
So it's not just about the technology itself, but also about the social context and how people choose to use it.
Exactly. It's like with the internet. It could have easily become an exclusive tool for academics and the military, but people pushed for open access and widespread adoption.
And that shaped its evolution into the global communication platform we know today.
Precisely. It's a dynamic interplay between technology and society.
Okay, so it's a push and pull, with technology shaping us and us shaping technology.
Exactly. And if you want a prime example of this dynamic, look no further than the internet itself.
Oh, I completely agree. From its humble beginnings as a military communication network to this vast ecosystem of social media, e-commerce, everything, it's amazing how far it's come.
I know. It's hard to imagine life without it now. Think about how it's changed, how we communicate, how we learn, how we shop, how we consume entertainment.
Right. Like just yesterday, we were using dial-up modems, and today we're streaming movies in 4K.
It's mind-boggling how quickly things have changed.
I know, right? And it raises so many questions about the future of media, about our own identities in this digital age.
Lots to think about. But before we get too philosophical, let's shift gears to the economic side of things. Chapter 3, the economics of media.
All right, let's talk money. This chapter always fascinates me. It's about the business of media, the forces that shape the content we consume, whether we're aware of them or not.
And it's important to understand that media companies, just like any business, need to make money to survive.
Right. But how does that drive what we see on our screens, what we hear on the radio, what we read in magazines? That's what we're going to unpack in this chapter.
It's about understanding how those revenue streams, whether it's advertising, subscriptions, or pay-per-view, influence what gets produced and distributed.
So let's dive in and explore the financial forces that shape the media landscape.
Let's do it. We'll start by acknowledging the elephant in the room. Media is a business.
Right. At the end of the day, media companies need to make money. They have to pay their employees, cover those production costs, keep the lights on.
Exactly. And that's why they're constantly looking for ways to minimize risk and maximize profit.
Which brings us to that age-old question. Does money influence the content we see?
Oh, absolutely. If a certain type of show consistently gets those high ratings or attracts those lucrative advertising deals, you can bet those networks will want to create more of it.
Hence, the endless stream of reality TV shows.
Precisely. They're cheap to produce. They often draw large audiences, making them a pretty safe bet for those networks.
Okay, so from a business perspective, it makes sense to go with what works, what brings in the cash.
Right. It does, but it also raises questions about the potential for bias or a lack of diversity in programming.
Right. If the bottom line is the driving force, what happens to those unique voices, those stories that might not be as commercially viable?
That's a great question. And it leads us to another key topic in this chapter: ownership structures in the media industry.
Ownership structures. Okay, unpack that one for me.
Essentially, it's about who owns and controls the media. And in many cases, we're seeing a trend towards concentration of ownership.
Concentration of ownership, what does that mean?
It means that a relatively small number of large corporations dominate the global media landscape.
So instead of having a wide range of independent voices, we end up with a handful of powerful companies dictating what we see and hear.
Exactly. It raises concerns about limited viewpoints and a lack of diversity in the content we consume.
It's like looking at the world through a narrow lens, right?
Yeah.
And missing out on the richness and complexity of different perspectives.
Precisely. And to understand this further, we need to grasp those concepts of vertical and horizontal integration.
Okay, vertical integration, horizontal integration, I always get those mixed up.
Think of a company like Disney. They produce their own movies and TV shows. They distribute them through their own channels like ABC and Disney plus Warward. They even own theme parks and merchandise stores.
So they control the entire pipeline, from creation to consumption.
Exactly. That's vertical integration. When a company controls all stages of production and distribution for a specific type of media.
Wow, that's a lot of power concentrated in one company.
It is. And horizontal integration is when a company owns different types of media. They might own newspapers, radio stations, television networks, and even online platforms.
So it's like a media empire with tentacles reaching into every corner of the industry.
Precisely. And both vertical and horizontal integration can lead to greater media concentration.
Which, as we discussed, can have implications for media diversity, editorial independence, and even the democratic process itself.
Right. It's something to keep in mind as we consume media and as we think about its impact on our society. But speaking of shaking things up, We can't forget about those digital giants that are rewriting the rules of the media game.
Oh yeah, companies like Facebook, Google, YouTube, they've completely changed the landscape.
Right. They've created what we call the attention economy, where our time and attention are the most valuable commodities. They're constantly collecting data on us, using it to personalize content and sell targeted advertising.
It's crazy to think about how much power they have over what we see and how we interact with the world online.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure. These platforms can connect people, they can amplify marginalized voices, they can facilitate social movements.
But they can also create echo chambers, reinforcing our existing beliefs and limiting our exposure to different perspectives.
Precisely. It's a complex landscape to navigate, but it's important to be aware of the forces at play, both the good and the bad.
Okay, so from media moguls to tech giants, we're getting a good sense of how money and power shape the media industry.
But let's not forget about the people who actually make media happen. The
Yeah.
workers behind the scenes.
Oh yeah, let's go behind the curtain and see how the magic happens. Chapter 4 takes us into the world of media production.
It's called the production perspective, and it focuses on the processes, the constraints, the decisions involved in creating media content.
So it's not just about the final product, the movie or the news article, but about understanding all the social, economic, and institutional factors that shape its creation.
You got it.
I'm ready to get that insider's view.
It's fascinating stuff, and it really highlights the human element of the media industry. Those creative minds, those skilled professionals, they're the ones who bring those stories and ideas to life.
Right, but I have a feeling it's not all creative freedom and artistic expression in the real world, is it?
Probably not. Remember that tension between structure and agency we talked about earlier? It's alive and well in the world of media production.
Okay, remind me again. What are structure and agency?
Think of structure as all those external forces that shape media production. Organizational hierarchies, industry regulations, even cultural norms.
So it's like the framework within which media workers have to operate.
Exactly. And agency is the ability of individuals to make choices and exert their own influence within those constraints.
Okay, so it's a constant push and pull between the rules and the freedom to create.
Yeah.
But how does this play out in the real world? Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine a journalist who wants to cover a controversial story, but her editor is hesitant because it might offend those advertisers or alienate certain readers.
Ah, I see. The journalist has the agency to pursue the story, but the structure of the news organization, the industry's economic realities, might limit her ability to publish it.
Precisely. It's a constant negotiation between individual creativity and those larger forces at play.
It's a delicate balance, and it makes you wonder how those pressures impact the quality and depth of reporting.
It's a valid concern. And this chapter also talks about those conventions and professional practices that influence how media gets made. It's like there are these unwritten rules that everyone in the industry understands.
So those conventions provide a framework, a kind of shared language for how things are done.
Exactly. Like in the news industry, there are established norms about what constitutes newsworthiness, how reporters gather information, how news stories are structured.
So those conventions can be helpful, but they can also limit creativity or reinforce certain biases.
That's right. And those conventions vary across different types of media. Television and film production have their own set of conventions around storytelling, genre, and technical aspects.
It's interesting to think about how those conventions have evolved over time, especially with the rise of new technologies. Like, reality TV has its own set of conventions that blur the lines between documentary and entertainment.
A great example. And it's not just those behind-the-scenes folks, but also the executives and producers who play a role in shaping the media we consume.
They're the ones who make those decisions about what gets produced, how it's framed, what ultimately reaches the audience.
They're those gatekeepers of information. It's a powerful role. And it requires a delicate balance. Too much control can stifle creativity, but too little can lead to chaos.
It's like they're walking a tightrope, trying to balance those competing demands.
It is, and it's important to understand all those factors that influence their decisions, whether it's organizational policies, industry norms, or even individual biases.
Right, because at the end of the day, media is made by people, and those people bring their own values, beliefs, and experiences to the table.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got those economic pressures, those power dynamics, those creative tensions. But we can't talk about media production without acknowledging the elephant in the room, technology.
Oh, yeah. Technology's impact on media production is huge. Think about digital editing software, online publishing platforms, social media as a distribution channel.
It's a whole different world compared to just a few decades ago.
And it's constantly evolving. Media professionals are constantly learning new skills, adapting to those changing platforms.
It's exciting, but also a bit daunting, right?
Yeah.
Trying to keep up with that pace of change.
It is. But technology has also done more than just change the how of media production. It's also blurred the lines between those different types of media. Think about Henry Jenkins's concept of convergence culture.
Convergence culture. Okay, I remember that term from our readings. Isn't that about the merging of old and new media?
Yes, it's that collision of traditional and new media that creates those new forms of content and new ways of interacting with it.
So instead of thinking about them as separate things, we need to see how they're blending together, influencing each other, and creating something new.
Exactly. Think about news organizations. They're not just publishing print articles anymore. They're creating online videos, podcasts, social media posts, all covering the same story from those different angles and reaching those diverse audiences.
It's a multi-platform approach to storytelling, meeting those audiences where they are. Okay, I'm starting to see how convergence culture is changing. Not only how media is produced, but also how we as audiences consume and interact with it.
It's fascinating.
Right.
But we should also consider those challenges that come with all this innovation.
Right. What are some of the challenges that media workers face in this rapidly evolving landscape? I know you mentioned economic pressures earlier. Can you elaborate on that?
Absolutely. The reality is most media organizations operate within a commercial framework. They have to make money to survive, and that often translates into pressure to cut costs, increase efficiency, and prioritize content that attracts large audiences or brings in those lucrative advertising deals.
So those pressures can trickle down to those individual media workers, impacting their working conditions, job security, even their creative freedom.
Exactly. It's tough out there. And this chapter also discusses the lack of diversity in media work.
Oh, that's a crucial issue. We need to see a wider range of voices and perspectives shaping the stories we see and hear.
Absolutely. Diversity in media work is essential for creating content that is inclusive, representative, and reflects those complexities of our society.
It's about making sure everyone's stories are told and that those different perspectives are valued.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've got economic pressures, diversity issues, any other big challenges we should be aware of?
Well, ethical dilemmas are pretty common in the media world.
Right, like how do you balance the need to inform the public with the responsibility to protect sources, maintain privacy, avoid sensationalism?
Exactly. Those ethical dilemmas are amplified in the digital age, with the speed at which information travels and the potential for harm through those online platforms.
So it's more important than ever for media professionals to think critically, act ethically, and really consider the potential consequences of their actions.
Absolutely.
Okay, so to sum up this chapter, what are those key takeaways we should really focus on for the exam?
Remember that production perspective. Focus on those processes, those constraints that shape how media is created.
Okay, got it. Production perspective. What else?
Understand that tension between structure and agency in media work, how media professionals balance their creative choices with those demands of their organizations.
Structure versus agency. Got it.
And don't forget about those conventions and professional practices, those unwritten rules that shape the media we consume.
Conventions and professional practices. Check.
And finally, that impact of technology. It's changing the game from the tools used to the very nature of media jobs.
Okay, that's a lot to take in, but I think I'm starting to get a better grasp of the complexities of media production. Now let's move on to Chapter 5. Ideology in media. This one always makes my head spin a little.
I know what you mean. It can be a bit abstract, but it's about understanding those underlying messages, those hidden meanings embedded in the media we consume.
Right. It's about recognizing that media is never truly neutral. It always reflects certain values, beliefs, and perspectives. But let's break it down. What exactly do we mean by ideology in the context of media?
Ideology refers to that system of beliefs, values, and ideas that shape how we understand the world. And media plays a powerful role in transmitting and reinforcing, sometimes even challenging those ideologies.
So it's like a hidden layer of meaning that shapes how we interpret the world around us.
You got it. It's not just about the information itself, but about the underlying messages and assumptions embedded in how that information is presented.
But how does that actually play out in media content?
Well, think about how certain social groups are represented in movies and TV shows.
Okay, like the classic damsel in distress, waiting to be rescued by a strong, heroic man.
Exactly. That reinforces those traditional gender roles, those stereotypes about women being helpless and men being saviors.
And those portrayals, even if they seem harmless, can shape how we view the world, how we understand our place in it. It's subtle but powerful.
Exactly.
Okay, so how do we start to unpack those ideological messages embedded in media?
Well, luckily, some brilliant minds have developed theories about ideology and media that can help us make sense of it all.
Okay, I'm ready to learn from those brilliant minds. Give me those theories.
First up, Karl Marx. He emphasized the role of economic power structures in shaping ideology.
Karl Marx. That name rings a bell from my sociology class.
He argued that the ruling class, those who control the means of production, use media to promote their own interests and maintain their dominance.
So, media is a tool for maintaining the status quo, for perpetuating that capitalist ideology.
That's the gist of it.
Okay, what other theories should we know about?
Antonio Gramsci and his concept of hegemony.
Hegemony. Didn't we talk about that earlier?
We did. Remember how we discussed how media can reinforce dominant ideologies? Well, Gramsci went deeper, explaining how the ruling class maintains its power through consent, not just force.
Ah, I see the connection. So media plays a role in getting people to accept the dominant ideology, making it seem like it's in everyone's best interests, even if it really only benefits a select few.
Exactly. Media shapes public opinion, normalizes those values and beliefs that benefit the powerful, making it hard to even imagine alternatives.
Okay, that's a bit mind-blowing, but I think I'm getting it. Who else should we know about?
Stuart Hall. His theory focuses on how media constructs meaning and shapes our understanding of reality.
Stuart Hall.
Oh.
Okay, tell me more about his ideas.
He argued that the way media represents the world through those images, those narratives, those frames, is never neutral or objective. It's always influenced by power, culture, and ideology.
So like how a news story is framed, the characters chosen for a movie, the music used in a commercial, all of these choices reflect certain values and beliefs.
Precisely. And those choices can have a profound impact on how audiences interpret information, form those opinions, even construct their identities.
It's about understanding the power of representation and recognizing that media doesn't just mirror reality, it actively shapes it.
Exactly. It's about understanding those subtle ways in which media influences how we see the world and ourselves.
Okay, so we've got a good foundation in some of those key theories of ideology in media. But how does this all play out in real-world examples?
Well, this chapter dives into media representations of class, race, and gender.
Okay, let's start with class.
Yeah.
How does media typically portray different social classes?
Media representations of class often reinforce this idea of the American dream, where anyone can achieve success through hard work and determination, but it often ignores those systemic barriers, those inequalities that make upward mobility much more difficult for some than for others.
Right, like everyone can pull themselves up by their bootstraps if they just try hard enough.
Exactly. But it's not always that simple.
And those portrayals can really impact how we view poverty, welfare, and even those policies designed to address economic inequality.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's move on to race. How does media represent different racial and ethnic groups?
Media has a long and troubled history of perpetuating those racial stereotypes.
Unfortunately, that's true. From the early days of film to contemporary news coverage, we've seen those harmful representations that can fuel real-world discrimination.
It's heartbreaking how those stereotypes can impact people's lives. And it's not always about those negative portrayals. Sometimes the problem is a lack of representation altogether.
The invisibility factor. The absence of certain groups can be just as harmful as those negative stereotypes.
Exactly. It sends the message that their stories, their experiences, their perspectives aren't important.
And that can shape how we understand history, how we view culture, even how we define ourselves.
Absolutely.
Okay, and finally, let's talk about gender. How does media represent masculinity and femininity?
Often, it reinforces those traditional gender roles, portraying men as strong, assertive, dominant, while women are seen as passive, emotional, or mainly focused on their appearance.
And those limited portrayals can be damaging for both men and women, reinforcing those narrow expectations about how we should behave and what roles we should play in society.
Right. It's important to ask whose stories are being told, whose perspectives are being privileged, and how do those choices shape our understanding of gender?
Okay, so class, race, gender. We're starting to see those deeper layers of meaning embedded in media. But what about the political realm? How does media shape our understanding of politics and influence those political processes?
That's a big one. This chapter focuses on how media functions as a political tool, shaping public opinion, framing political debates, influencing how we participate in the political process.
So it's not just about reporting on events, it's about actively shaping those events and how we understand them.
Precisely.
Okay, I'm ready to get into the nitty-gritty of media and politics. What are some of the key concepts we need to grasp? I know we talked about framing before.
Right. Framing is about how media presents an issue, what aspects they choose to highlight, what they downplay, and it can have a big impact on how those audiences interpret that issue.
So like a news story about immigration could focus on the economic impact or the humanitarian crisis, depending on the outlet's political leanings.
Exactly. Or how coverage of crime can frame it as an individual problem or systemic issue.
And those different frames can lead to very different solutions.
Absolutely. Framing is just one way in which media can shape those political narratives.
Two.
So how does the media actually influence those campaigns and elections?
Well, think about those sound bites, those attack ads, that constant 2047 news cycle. They all play a role in shaping public opinion and influencing how people vote.
It's a lot to process, for sure. And with social media, campaigns have become even more sophisticated in using data and those online tactics to persuade voters.
That's a whole new ballgame.
That is.
But what about the role of media in a democracy? Isn't it supposed to inform the public and hold those in power accountable?
Ideally, yes. But in reality, the relationship between media and democracy is messy.
I can imagine.
It's full of tensions and contradictions.
So on the one hand, media can empower citizens, expose corruption, give a voice to the voiceless.
Exactly.
But on the other hand, it can also be used to manipulate public opinion, spread propaganda, and reinforce existing power structures.
It's a double-edged sword, for sure.
It sounds like we need to be very critical consumers of media, especially when it comes to politics.
Absolutely. And this chapter highlights some of those key challenges and critiques of media's role in the political world.
Let's talk about those challenges. One of the biggest ones we face today is the spread of fake news and misinformation.
Right. It's a huge problem. The internet has made it so easy for false or misleading information to spread like wildfire.
And it can have a real impact on trust in institutions, on those public conversations, even on the democratic process itself.
Exactly. It undermines the very foundations of a healthy democracy.
But it's not always about those outright lies, right?
No, sometimes it's more subtle.
Like biased reporting, selective framing, cherry-picking data to support a particular narrative.
Exactly. Or just omitting key information that might challenge the dominant view.
And then there's that echo chamber effect, where we're only exposed to information that confirms our existing beliefs.
It's like we're all living in our own little bubbles, surrounded by people who think just like us.
And it makes it so hard to have productive conversations across those political divides.
It can feel impossible sometimes.
But it's important to try, right?
Absolutely. We need to be willing to engage with different perspectives, to challenge our own assumptions, to have those tough conversations.
Easier said than done.
I know, but it's crucial for a healthy democracy.
Okay, so we've talked about the dark side of media and politics. But let's not forget that media can also be a powerful force for good.
Oh, absolutely. It can hold those in power accountable, expose corruption, give voice to the voiceless.
And inspire social change.
Exactly. Think about the role of investigative journalism in uncovering scandals, holding those powerful people to account.
Or how social media has been used to mobilize movements for social justice.
It can be an incredible tool for positive change.
Okay, so despite all the challenges, there's still hope for media to play a positive role in the political world.
Definitely. But it requires us to be engaged citizens, to be critical thinkers, to demand better from our media.
I like that, demanding better from our media.
It's our responsibility.
Okay, so to wrap up this chapter on media's impact on the political world, what are those key takeaways we should remember for the exam?
First, understand that media is never neutral. It always shapes our understanding of politics, for better or worse.
Okay, media isn't neutral, got it. What else?
Be familiar with those concepts like agenda setting, framing, and the political economy of media. They're crucial for understanding how media influences the political process.
Agenda setting, framing, political economy. Check, check, check.
And finally, be aware of those challenges and opportunities presented by new media in the political realm. It's a whole new ballgame.
That it is.
So from the rise of social media to those concerns about fake news, the digital age has transformed how we engage with politics.
It's a lot to wrap our heads around.
It is, but it's also exciting.
It is.
It's a time of great change and possibility.
I agree. Okay, I'm feeling a bit more informed about the complex relationship between media and politics. Now let's shift gears and talk about the other side of the equation, the audience. Chapter 8 explores active audiences and media engagement. It's about recognizing that we're not just passive sponges soaking up information. We actually have agency in shaping our media experience.
We're not just sitting there like zombies absorbing whatever's thrown at us.
Exactly. We're interacting, we're interpreting, we're even creating our own media.
We've got that power.
And that's pretty cool.
It is. It's a shift from that old model of the passive audience, just blindly accepting whatever they see or hear.
So we're active participants in this whole media game.
We are.
But how does this active audience thing actually play out in real life?
Well, this chapter highlights several ways we engage with media, from how we interpret those messages to how we use social media to create and share our own content.
Okay, let's start with interpretation. How do different people make sense of the same media content?
Have you heard of Stuart Hall's encoding-decoding model?
I think so, but remind me.
It's about how a media message, encoded with a particular meaning by the producer, can be decoded in various ways by different audiences.
Okay, so the producer might have a specific message in mind, but the audience can interpret it differently.
Exactly.
So what are those different ways of decoding?
Hollow outlines 3 main types of readings: preferred, negotiated, and oppositional.
Okay, break it down for me.
The preferred reading is when the audience interprets the message exactly as the producer intended. They're buying what the producer is selling, so to speak.
So they're accepting that dominant meaning without really questioning it.
Right. They're going with the flow.
Okay, got it. What about the negotiated reading?
A negotiated reading is when the audience accepts some parts of the message, but rejects or modifies others. They're kind of meeting the producer halfway.
So they're engaging more critically with the content, picking and choosing what resonates with them.
Precisely.
And finally, the oppositional reading. What's that all about?
That's the most critical reading. The audience completely rejects the producer's intended meaning.
They're like, nope, not buying it.
Exactly. They might see through the dominant ideology, challenge those underlying assumptions, or even create a whole new meaning.
It's like they're rewriting the story.
In a way, yes. They're actively resisting that dominant narrative and constructing their own meaning.
It's amazing how one piece of media can be interpreted in so many ways.
Right. And that's known as polysemy. The idea that media texts can have multiple meanings.
Polysemy. That's a good word to know for the exam.
Definitely.
But what influences those different readings? Why might one person have a preferred reading while another has an oppositional one?
It all comes down to context. This chapter emphasizes those factors that shape how we interpret and engage with media.
Okay, like what kind of factors?
Well, our social position plays a huge role. Things like our age, gender, race, class, cultural background, all of those things influence how we see the world.
And how we decode those media messages.
Exactly.
So our lived experiences, the social groups we belong to, they all shape how we make sense of media.
They do.
So a teenager might interpret a song differently than their parents.
Right. Or someone who's experienced discrimination might view a news story about race relations differently than someone who hasn't.
Because their experiences have shaped how they see the world.
Exactly.
And it's not just about individual differences, right?
Yeah.
The broader social and cultural context matters too.
Absolutely. The political climate, the dominant ideologies of a society, even those current events can influence how we interpret media.
It's all interconnected.
It is.
Now, we can't talk about active audiences without talking about social media.
Oh, absolutely not. Social media has completely changed the game when it comes to audience engagement.
I know. It's like everyone's a media critic, a commentator, a creator.
Right. Social media has empowered audiences to create and share their own content, their own perspectives.
It's like we're all part of this giant conversation now.
In a way, yes.
And that's a powerful thing.
It is. It's a shift from that top-down model of media where those big corporations controlled the flow of information.
Now it's more like a two-way street. But with all this user-generated content out there, it can be hard to know what to trust.
That's true.
How do we sift through all that noise and find the information that's reliable?
Well, that's where those algorithms come in.
Right. Those mysterious algorithms.
Social media platforms use algorithms to filter content, personalize those recommendations, and shape what we see in our feeds.
So they're trying to make our online experience more tailored to our interests. But it also creates those filter bubbles and echo chambers we talked about.
Yeah, exactly.
It's a bit of a trade-off.
It is.
But despite those challenges, social media has also become a powerful tool for collective action and social change.
Absolutely. Think about movements like #BlackLivesMatter and #MeToo. They wouldn't have gained such momentum without social media.
Right. It's helped to connect people, raise awareness, and mobilize those who want to make a difference.
It's been incredible to witness.
It has. But this brings up another important point, the digital divide.
Ah, yes, the digital divide.
Not everyone has equal access to these digital platforms and the opportunities they offer.
That's true.
It's a gap that needs to be addressed if we truly want to harness the power of social media for good.
Absolutely. We need to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to participate in this digital world.
Okay, so the digital divide is a challenge, but social media has also opened up new possibilities for how we engage with media and with each other.
It's been a game changer, for sure.
It has. Okay, let's recap those key takeaways about active audiences and media engagement before we move on.
Sounds good.
First, remember that the audience is no longer passive. We're actively involved in shaping our media experiences.
We're not just consumers, we're producers, too.
Right. We're creating, sharing, and shaping those media landscapes.
Exact.
Second, that encoding-decoding model is crucial. Those preferred, negotiated, and oppositional readings help us understand how different audiences interpret the same content.
It's a useful tool for analyzing media.
It is. Third, those contextual factors matter.
Yeah.
Our social position, our lived experiences, they all shape how we make sense of the media.
Our identities and experiences matter.
They do.
And finally, social media has revolutionized how we engage with media, both in terms of those opportunities for participation and those challenges like algorithms and filter bubbles.
It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape.
It is.
Okay, I'm feeling pretty good about this chapter. It's empowering to think about the audience as active and engaged, not just passive recipients of information.
I agree.
Okay, ready for the final chapter?
Bring it on.
Chapter 9 is all about traditional versus new media. It's about exploring those distinctions, those convergences, and the impacts of this media evolution on society and culture.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is. So let's start with the basics. What do we even mean by traditional media?
Well, when we talk about traditional media, we're referring to those forms of mass communication that were dominant before the internet came along.
Okay, so like newspapers, magazines, radio, television, the media of our parents' generation.
Exactly, those are the classics.
And what are some of the key characteristics of traditional media?
Well, one of the defining features is one-way communication. The content flows from the producer to the audience with limited opportunity for interaction or feedback.
So it's like that classic image of a family gathered around the radio listening to the evening news.
Precisely.
Or everyone watching the same TV show at the same time.
Right. It's a more passive form of media consumption.
Okay, got it. What else?
Another key characteristic is control. Traditional media is typically owned and operated by large corporations or government entities.
So they have a lot of power over what gets produced and distributed.
They do. And that can raise concerns about potential biases, censorship, a lack of diverse voices.
Right. It's important to be aware of who controls the media and what their agenda might be.
Absolutely. Now, in contrast to traditional media, new media is all about interactivity, user-generated content, decentralization, and accessibility.
Okay, so new media is more democratic, more participatory, more open.
Exactly.
Anyone with an internet connection can potentially create and share their own content.
That's the beauty of it.
It's amazing how technology has empowered individuals to become media producers.
It has. And this shift has really challenged those traditional gatekeepers of information.
So it's not just those big corporations calling the shots anymore.
Right.
It's a more level playing field.
In a way, yes.
But with all this new media out there, it can be overwhelming, right?
It can be.
How do we navigate this new media landscape?
Well, that's where media literacy skills come in. We need to be able to critically evaluate sources, identify biases, and understand how algorithms shape our online experiences.
It's like we need a whole new set of tools to make sense of this digital world.
We do.
Okay, so we've talked about the differences between traditional and new media, but it's not always a clear-cut distinction, right?
No, not at all.
There's a lot of overlap and convergence happening.
Exactly. Many traditional media outlets have adapted to the digital age by creating online platforms, embracing social media, even incorporating user-generated content.
So they're trying to stay relevant in this changing media landscape. It's fascinating to see how these different forms of media are coexisting and influencing each other.
It is. It's an ongoing evolution.
Okay, so it's not a battle for survival. It's more like a dance between old and new media.
I like that analogy.
And this convergence raises questions about the future of media and its impact on society.
Absolutely.
Will traditional media eventually become obsolete? Or will it find new ways to engage audiences?
That's the big question.
And how will new media continue to shape our understanding of the world, ourselves, and each other?
Lots to ponder.
It is. And it brings us back to those theories of media technology we discussed earlier, technological determinism and social constructionism.
Right. Those two perspectives offer different ways of thinking about the relationship between technology and society.
So, is technology driving those social changes? Or are those social forces shaping how we use technology?
It's probably a bit of both.
I think so too. It's a complex interplay.
It is.
Okay, but let's talk about some specific impacts of new media on society, both the good and the bad. On the positive side, new media has increased access to information and diverse perspectives. The internet has become a vast library of knowledge.
It's incredible. We have access to so much information at our fingertips.
I know. It's mind-blowing. And social media, despite its flaws, has created opportunities for connection and community building,
It's brought people together in ways that weren't possible before.
and facilitated those social movements that are challenging the status quo and fighting for justice.
It's been inspiring to see.
It has. But there are those downsides too, right?
Of course.
Like privacy concerns. With all that data collection happening online, it's harder than ever to control our personal information.
It's a valid concern.
And those algorithms, they can be used to manipulate our behavior and shape our perceptions.
It's something to be aware of.
And then there's the debate about whether new media is contributing to cultural homogenization or diversity.
Right. On the one hand, the internet connects people across cultures. But on the other hand, there's a risk that global media trends might overshadow those local cultures.
It's a complex issue with no easy answers.
It is, but it's something we need to be mindful of.
Okay, so new media has brought both opportunities and challenges.
It has.
And as technology continues to evolve, we'll have to grapple with those complexities and shape the future of media in a way that benefits everyone.
I agree.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into the world of media industries and audiences.
We have.
And I'm feeling a lot more prepared for that upcoming exam.
I'm glad to hear that.
Any final words of wisdom for our fellow students out there?
Remember, media is a powerful force that shapes our world. So be critical, be engaged, and be the change you want to see in the media landscape.
I love that. Be the change you want to see.
It's up to all of us to make media work for us, not against us.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into media industries and audiences. We hope you found it helpful and maybe even a little bit inspiring.
We'll catch you next time for another deep dive into a topic that matters.
Until then, stay curious, stay critical, and stay engaged. It's empowering to think about the audience as active and engaged, not just passive recipients of information.
I agree.
Okay, ready for the final chapter?
Bring it on.
Chapter 9 is all about traditional versus new media.
That's right.
It's about exploring the distinctions, the convergences, and the impacts of this media evolution on society and culture.
It's a fascinating topic.
It is.
For sure.
So let's start with the basics. What do we even mean by traditional media?
When we talk about traditional media, we're referring to those forms of mass communication that were dominant before the internet.
Okay, so like newspapers, magazines, radio, television,
Exactly.
the media of our parents' generation.
Yeah, the classics.
And what are some of the key characteristics of traditional media?
One of the defining features is one-way communication. The content flows from the producer to the audience with very limited opportunity for interaction.
So it's like that classic image of a family gathered around the radio, listening to the evening news, or huddled around the TV watching a show together.
Right.
It's a more passive form of media consumption.
It is.
Okay, got it.
What else? Another key characteristic is control. Traditional media is typically owned and operated by those large corporations or those government entities.
Giving them a lot of power over what gets produced and distributed,
Exactly.
which can be a bit worrying, right?
It
It
can.
raises those concerns about bias, censorship, lack of diverse voices.
Absolutely.
It's something to keep in mind as we consume those different types of media.
It is.
Now, in contrast to traditional media, new media is all about interactivity, user-generated content, decentralization,
Right. It's more accessible.
and accessibility.
Yeah.
So anyone with an internet connection can potentially create and share content.
Exactly.
It's pretty amazing how technology has kind of like empowered individuals to become those media producers.
It's a huge shift from that top-down model of media where those big corporations controlled everything.
Exactly. It's a more level playing field now.
It is, in a way.
But it also can be overwhelming.
It can.
There's so much out there.
There is.
How do we even navigate this new media landscape?
That's where media literacy comes in. Being able to critically evaluate sources.
Being able to think for yourself?
Yes, identify those biases, understand how those algorithms are working behind the scenes.
It's like we need a whole new set of skills to make sense of the digital world.
I think so too.
Okay, so we've talked about the differences between traditional and new media, but I think it's important to remember that it's not always a black and white situation.
No, not all.
There's a lot of overlap
There is.
and convergence going on.
A lot of those traditional outlets, they've adapted to the digital age.
Exactly.
They're creating online platforms, using social media, even incorporating some of that user-generated content.
They're trying to keep up.
They are.
It's really interesting to see how these different forms of media are coexisting and influencing each other.
It is. It's constantly evolving.
So instead of viewing it as like a battle for survival,
Right?
it's more like a dance
I like that.
between the old and the new.
Yeah.
And this convergence raises questions about the future of media
It does.
and its impact on society.
For sure.
So will those traditional forms eventually become obsolete, or will they find new ways to engage audiences?
It's hard to say.
And how is new media going to continue to shape our understanding of the world?
Our understanding of ourselves and each other.
So many questions.
There are.
And it brings us back to those theories of media technology that we talked about.
Technological determinism versus social constructionism.
Right. So is technology driving these social changes, or is it the other way around?
It's likely a bit of both.
It's that complex interplay.
It is.
But let's get into some specifics about the impacts of new media on society.
Okay.
Both the good and the bad.
All right.
So, on the positive side, new media has definitely increased access to information and diverse perspectives.
The internet has become this incredible resource for learning.
It's amazing, right?
It is.
And social media has created those opportunities for connection and community building.
Even though it has its downsides.
It does.
It's brought people together.
It has. And we've seen those movements for social justice
Exactly.
gain momentum through social media.
It's been amazing to see.
It has been.
For sure.
But there are some downsides.
There are.
We have to talk about those privacy concerns.
Right.
All that data collection.
It's a valid concern.
It can feel a bit creepy sometimes.
It can.
And those algorithms.
They can be used to manipulate us.
Exactly. And then there's that debate about whether new media is contributing to, like, cultural homogenization or diversity.
Yeah.
On the one hand, it connects people across cultures. But on the other hand, there's a risk that global media trends might overshadow those local cultures.
It's a tough one.
It is.
Lots of factors to consider.
It is a very complex issue.
It is.
And I think as technology continues to evolve, we're going to have to continue to think about these things and how we can shape the future of media in a responsible way. Well, I don't know about you, but I feel like we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive
We have.
into the world of media industries and audiences.
At FNR.
And I'm feeling way more prepared for that exam now.
That's the goal.
It is.
I hope everyone else feels that way too.
I hope so too.
Yeah.
Any final words of wisdom for our fellow students out there as they get ready to tackle those exams?
Remember, media is powerful. Be critical, be engaged, be the change you want to see in the media landscape.
That's fantastic advice. Be the change you want to see.
We all have a role to play
We do.
in shaping the future of media.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into media industries and audiences. We hope you learned something new.
And had a little bit of fun along the way.
Definitely. Until next time, stay curious and stay critical.
And thanks for listening.